Sup, gamers? Random Potato here with a review of the new and improved Occultist in the latest update patch for Darkest Dungeon 2. The Occultist has long been considered among the bottom tier of classes, with Warlock, Spaghetti, and Meatballs being the primary use of all hazard, with his heal being a disaster to utilize, and his non-burning stars unchecked power payoffs being mediocre. The latest update patch for Darkest Dungeon 2, which focused on an Act 3 rework and the new Death Armor mechanic, also switched up a lot of the Occultist skills. In my opinion, the biggest upgrade is the change to Weird Reconstruction. Weird Reconstruction is an RNG heal, healing between 0 and 33% of max HP, 0 to 50% on upgrade, with a chance of bleed attached. This used to have a dangerously low use threshold below 33%, but now that has been improved to 50%, in line with the Plague Doctor's heals, with absolutely no use limit or cooldowns. The RNG element keeps Occultist from being a healer main on the level of Plague Doctor, Flagellant, or Seraph Vestal, but it's certainly viable, especially on the Ritualist path, where I didn't really feel like it was before. The high end, especially with guaranteed unchecked power crit, can also completely fix up a dying tank in a way no other skill in this game can. It's arguably the best heal early in a profile, when PD only has her use-limited medicine, which makes Occultist now a premier unlock, especially since Ritualist is his first path. The second main change to Occultist was another buff to Ritualist, his weakest overall path pre-patch. Malediction, long considered one of the worst skills in the game, is a debuff that makes an enemy gain a random 2-point dot every time they are damaged. Pre-patch, this debuff lasted for 3 turns, making it entirely useless against bosses, the only type of enemy a super slow skill like this would even be good against. It's now a 3-round debuff, making it absolutely absurd against those same bosses, even more so now that this patch also reduced the Act 3 boss's debuff resistance, the hardest boss in the game. The same downside of this skill exists, with enemy debuff resist still playing a devastating role in many other boss fights, often forcing you to bring an inferior owl pet build for more certainty, and of course dot resist itself mattering a great deal, even with the Malediction upgrade that reduces dot resistance. For example, Librarian will straight up ignore this debuff a third of the time with his burn immunity. On the other hand, Malediction has no use limit or cooldowns like other elite DPS skills, meaning a well-timed Chaotic Offering and some extra action generation through Encore, Temptation, or Pocket Watch means you can spam and stack this debuff for absolutely insane numbers. I've gotten to 40 a turn with no other team dot generation. It's certainly not in the top tier of boss damage strats, but the fact that Ritualist is now an elite class healer makes him an acceptable non-meme build hero. They also changed Binding Shadows to be launched from ranks 2 to 4, with no more forward movement, making it a real selectable skill rather than something you slap in meme dance teams, and has a role as a rank 4 Occultist skill that can still proc rank 1. Now, the same downsides of Occultist still exist. The RNG aspect of Weird means that despite it now being on average, on par, or better than other heals, you will still often risk death in situations where you wouldn't need to with a more consistent hero, and even without the pure bottom rolls, you'll often have to waste multiple turns to do what a standard healer does in one, greatly hurting your tempo, which Occultist already lacks. Chaotic Offering is still a disaster of a skill, being your only true way of generating consistent unchecked power tokens when you need them early in the combats. Chaotic Offering, of course, will choose a random debuff, with Blind and Stun completely destroying any semblance of tempo your team would have with any of his payoffs, and Weak destroying the value of Anamnesis and Burning Stars. Stars is the only nuke left that goes through block, making it elite in Acts 2, 3, and 4, but the downside is a bit absurd, especially considering the downsides that already come with a Warlock Stars build. In addition, this update patched the chance for Occultist to sometimes not face a debuff, and the random shuffle now returns, entirely obliterating Warlock and Anamnesis builds, and still obnoxiously ruining positioning with other builds. You still have to press the button in all boss combats for your Occultist to have any value at all, but the value tanks in normal combats, where Occultist already suffers, and of course introduces RNG far beyond what the other heroes face. There's been a lot of memeing about Occultist now being S tier, especially given his fan favorite status as a DD1 utility hero. Unfortunately, the truth is he's still stuck somewhere in the mid-tier of heroes overall. Rank 4 Warlock spamming Spaghetti and Meatballs is still his best build, and is still far and away the most fragile of all non-meme builds, with garbage HP and constant self-burn from unchecked power, though the Churge's table update being able to more reliably find the apron makes it a bit better to run. As said before, Chaotic Offering is way more risk than any other damage dealer in this game has to take in order to function. Aspirant remains just okay, doing mediocre damage but at least having some tankiness if you're bored of real heroes, and the heal being viable now means you can run more interesting backline duos if you want. Anamnesis is still good, specifically at cleaning up in Phase 1 of the Act 3 boss, and literally nothing else. And finally we have Ritualist, which I have long rated as among the worst paths in the game. This was obviously the most improved path in this update. It is certainly not S tier, but it has its place against specifically the Acts 3 and 4 bosses. It's still extremely bad in normal fights, with curses being pathetically slow and low impact against generic mobs, malediction being useless, and your only offense usually being Binding Shadows, which does near nothing, but is thankfully now usable from rank 4, which lets you hide your fragile Occultist, who self-vulns regularly as part of the path. There are of course a few trinkets that counter this debuff, but it's still somewhat a problem in the tougher fights, though nowhere near as fragile as Warlock. In lair boss fights, Malediction is okay, though not as good as against Act bosses. The Librarian takes a lot of actions to potentially proc Malediction, but as said before, will resist 1 in 3 guaranteed. Harvest Child takes a couple turns per round, but will often resist the Blight. You definitely want the Malediction upgrade. The General only has 1 action per round, making it relatively less effective. And finally, the Leviathan doesn't really have enough actions either for this to be good, but Leviathan is dumb anyways, and there's no reason to bring a Ritualist there. This of course shines in the new Act 3 boss fight, with its 3 actions per round, relatively low dot resist, and near non-existent debuff resist. In addition, in Act 3 the torch buff is more healing, making your Ritualist heals absolutely absurd. Dots are still the way to play Act 3, and this makes Ritualist one of the better boss killers for the hardest boss in the game, which redeems it from being mediocre elsewhere. It's also pretty good in Act 4, not because of Malediction, because the phases don't really last long enough there, but with Vuln Hex both removing dodge and block when upgraded, it's quite strong, though Phase 1 has a very high debuff resist. Even Full Owl isn't guaranteed to proc, but Phase 2 is free. Overall, it's still nowhere near the holy trifecta of Man-at-Arms, Plague Doctor, and Flagellant, but that's more a function of those heroes being completely broken. It's not as consistent as the Hellion, Howerman, Jester, Grave Robber, Runaway Tire either, especially since he's useless in normal fights, which is not the most important thing, obviously, but matters sometimes. However, the ability to absolutely steamroll the Act 3 boss, and the ability to now act as a solo healer opens up a lot more comps, and he is certainly no longer bottom tier, easily clearing Vestal, who is now my pick for worst overall hero, which makes DD2's roster relatively balanced, far more than Darkest Dungeon 1 was. And most importantly, he is now fun, which is the only stat that really matters, right?